My name is Sarah Brennan, and I am a forensic accountant. And I had been working at Callaway Meridian Asset Management for 6 years when I found what I found. And the finding happened not because I was looking for it specifically, but because my job requires me to read full cross-ledger records across complete fiscal periods. And most people who review financial documents do not do this because it is slow and painstaking and unrewarding. 99% of the time. And the 1% of the time when it is not unrewarding is exactly the 1% that most people miss because they stopped reading before they got there. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and I was the last person in the office, which was not unusual because I work better in silence, and the kind of silence that exists in a large open-plan office after 7 in the evening is a different quality of silence than the silence of an empty flat, and I have always found it easier to see clearly in that particular quiet. And I was on the 4th year of a standard internal audit covering client fund movement and reinvestment cycles when I found the first irregularity, which was not dramatic and was a routing entry for a client fund transfer that moved through an intermediary account before reaching its destination. And the intermediary account had a registration number that resolved to a shell entity incorporated in the Cayman Islands, and the shell entity had been dormant for 2 years before this transfer passed through it and became dormant again. Immediately afterward, I wrote the account number in my notebook. I kept reading. I found the second instance, 40 minutes later, in a different client portfolio in a different fiscal quarter. And the intermediary account was different. But the shell entity structure was the same. And the dormancy pattern was the same. And the percentage skimmed before the remainder was forwarded to the correct destination was the same, which was 1.3%, and 1.3% of a high-value institutional fund transfer is not a rounding error, and is not a system anomaly, and is not the kind of thing that happens twice by accident in 2 different portfolios, in 2 different quarters. I kept reading. By 11 that evening, I had found 9 instances across 4 years and 3 separate client portfolios, and the pattern was consistent in its structure and varied only in the specific shell entities used, which rotated on a schedule that was irregular enough to resist casual detection, but regular enough that once you were reading the full cross-ledger, simultaneously, the rotation itself became part of the signature, and the signature was clear, and the signature had a logic. And the logic was the logic of someone who understood the system well enough to know exactly how much could be taken from exactly which accounts, without triggering the automated threshold alerts that the compliance system was calibrated to catch. I sat in the empty office for a long time after that. The city was quiet outside the window, and the screen in front of me had 9 flagged entries and a total figure that I had calculated twice to make sure, and the total figure across 4 years was not small and was the kind of number that has consequences. And I thought about what I was looking at, and I thought about what the correct procedure was, which I knew precisely because I had read the firm's compliance protocol documentation when I joined, and again 2 years later when it was updated, and the correct procedure was to file an internal report through the designated compliance portal with full supporting documentation, and to do so within 48 hours of the discovery. I filed the report on Wednesday morning. At 8:53, I attached the cross-ledger analysis and the shell entity registration records and the dormancy pattern, documentation, and the calculated total, and I submitted it through the correct channel, and I received an automated acknowledgement at 8:54, and I went to my desk, and I began the ordinary work of the day. 6 days passed. On the Thursday of the following week, I received a calendar invitation from HR for a meeting that afternoon with no subject line and no agenda. And I attended the meeting, and the HR director was a woman named Patricia, and she had a pleasant face and a careful manner, and she asked me to confirm my full name and my employee number. And when I gave both of them, she looked at her screen for a moment, and then she said that she was having difficulty locating my personnel file and asked if I could confirm my start date and my current role title. And I confirmed both, and she looked at her screen again and said that the system was showing no current record for my name or employee number, and that it appeared there may have been a data migration issue, and she asked me to spell my surname. I spelled it. She typed it. She looked at the screen. She said she would need to escalate the issue and that in the meantime she had to inform me that as the system held no record of my current employment status, I would need to suspend my building access and work remotely until the situation was resolved, and that if the file could not be recovered, I might be asked to resubmit my employment documentation and undergo a refreshed onboarding process. I looked at her for a moment. I thanked her, and I picked up my bag, and I walked to the lift, and I pressed the button for the ground floor, and I stood in the lobby while the security desk processed my access card, and the guard on the desk, who had greeted me by name every morning for 6 years, looked at his screen, and then looked at me and said, "The system was showing my card as unregistered and asked if I had my original employment letter with me." I said I would get back to him. I walked out through the glass doors into the March afternoon, and I stood on the pavement, and the city moved around me the way cities move, which is without noticing and without pausing, and I stood there for a moment, and then I walked to my car, and I drove home, and I did not turn the radio on, and I did not call anyone. And I sat in the car outside my flat for a while after I parked, and I looked at the steering wheel, and I thought about the compliance report and the automated acknowledgement and the timestamp of 8:54 on a Wednesday morning. I went inside, I made tea. I opened the kitchen drawer, and I looked at the external hard drive sitting at the back of it. Behind the spare keys and the takeaway menus and the things you put in a kitchen drawer because you are not sure where else they belong. The hard drive contained a complete copy of every document I had attached to the compliance report. I had made the copy before I filed it. Not because I had expected this, because I am a forensic accountant. And a forensic accountant does not enter a system without documenting that she was there. I picked up the hard drive and I held it, and I sat down at the kitchen table. And I thought about patience, and I thought about the difference between a file that has been deleted and a fact that has been recorded, and I thought about what those two things are worth respectively when the time comes to place them in front of someone whose job it is to decide what is true. And then I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I wrote the date at the top, and I began. There is a particular quality to the silence of a flat that has been lived in alone for a long time, and it is not an empty silence, but a settled one, and it carries the specific texture of a life arranged according to its own logic, which is books stacked by subject and a kitchen organized by frequency of use, and a desk positioned to catch the morning light from the east-facing window. And I had always found that silence comfortable in the way that people find comfortable the spaces they have built to fit themselves precisely. And when I sat down at my desk that Thursday evening, the silence was the same as it had always been, and the flat was the same as it had always been. And I was the only thing in the room that had changed, which was that 6 hours ago, I had been a senior forensic accountant at a firm that now had no record I had ever existed. And the distance between those two versions of the same evening was not large enough to be visible from the outside, but from the inside. It was the distance between a floor that holds and a floor that has been discovered to be resting on nothing. I opened my personal laptop. I navigated to the Callaway Meridian Employee Portal, which was the external access point for remote working, and which I had used dozens of times from this desk on evenings when a deadline required it. And I typed my credentials, which were the same credentials I had typed into that portal for 6 years, and the page loaded and sat for a moment and then returned a single line of text, which said that the credentials I had entered did not match any active account in the system and invited me to contact IT support. If I believed this was an error, I looked at that line for a moment. I typed my credentials again carefully and deliberately, the way you do when you want to be certain that what is happening is what you think is happening and not a mistake on your part. And the page loaded and sat for a moment and returned the same line of text. And I closed the laptop and I sat back and I looked at the east-facing window, which was dark now and reflecting the room back at me. And I thought about the word active in the phrase active account. And I thought about what it means for an account to be made inactive and who has the permission level to do that, and how long it takes, and whether 6 days is enough time to route an instruction through the correct administrative channels, or whether an instruction like that requires someone to bypass the correct administrative channels entirely, and what bypassing them would look like in the access logs if anyone were to look. I picked up my phone. I want to tell you about Liam Chen because he matters to this part of the story, and because I want to be precise about who he was to me, which was not a close friend in the way that people use that word casually, but something more specific, which was a person I trusted professionally and had trusted for 4 years, and who had over those 4 years demonstrated a quality that is rarer in large institutions than people imagine, which was the quality of saying what he actually thought rather than what the situation seemed to call for. And Liam worked in the firm's IT infrastructure team, and we had collaborated on 3 internal audit projects, and he had always been direct with me, and I had always been direct with him. And that directness was the foundation of what I am going to call trust, because there is no more accurate word for it. I called his mobile. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had seen my name on the screen and chosen to answer rather than let it go, and I noted that I said his name. There was a pause, and in the pause I heard something that I recognized as the sound of a person deciding very quickly how much to say and what register to say it in. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than his normal register and had a quality to it that I had not heard from him before, which was the quality of someone speaking from inside a situation they had not chosen and could not see the edges of. He said my name back to me. And then he said that he could not have this conversation, and I said I understood. And I asked him only to tell me one thing, which was whether my system access had been removed through a standard administrative process. And there was another pause, and he said that there was no record of me in the current personnel system, and no record of my access credentials, and no record of my compliance submission in the portal logs. And then he said something that he said quietly and quickly, as though the speed of it might reduce its weight. And what he said was that there was no record of me ever having worked there at all. I sat very still. I asked him when it had happened, and he said he could not say. And I asked him if he was all right, and the pause this time was longer, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed again. And what it had changed into was something I can only describe as frightened. In the specific way that people are frightened when the thing they are afraid of is not abstract, but is present and is close. And he said that he needed me to not call this number again. And he said, please. And the please was the word that told me everything. The rest of the sentence had not said, which was that someone had spoken to him, and that the speaking had not been a conversation but an instruction, and that the instruction had made the consequences of further contact clear enough that a person who had always been direct with me was now asking me with genuine urgency to disappear from his phone. He ended the call. I put the phone down on the desk and I looked at it for a moment. And I looked at the dark window and I looked at the room, which was the same room it had always been. And I sat in the quiet of it, and I thought about what I now knew, which was not only that my file had been deleted and my credentials wiped and my report erased, but that the people who had known me inside that building had been visited, and that the visiting had been thorough enough to make Liam Chen, who had never been afraid of anything I had seen him encounter, become afraid of a phone call from someone he had trusted for 4 years. This was not a data migration issue. This was not an administrative error. This was a coordinated and deliberate erasure, and it had been executed with the kind of speed and reach that required planning and authority, and the specific institutional knowledge of exactly which records to delete, and exactly which people to speak to, and exactly how to speak to them. And whoever had done it had understood that the most effective way to make a person disappear from an institution is not to remove their name from a single system, but to remove them from the memory of the institution itself, which is made not of databases, but of people. And if the people no longer acknowledge that you existed, then the databases are almost a secondary concern. I got up and I turned off the overhead light. I sat back down at the desk in the dark with only the ambient light from the street coming through the east-facing window, and I thought about the word ghost, and I thought about what it means to be a ghost, which is not to be gone, but to be present in a place that has decided you are not there. And I thought about the difference between those two things, and the difference is everything. Because a ghost still knows what it saw. I reached into the kitchen drawer. I placed the hard drive on the desk in front of me. I connected it to the laptop, and I opened the first folder, which was the cross-ledger analysis, and I opened my notebook to the page with the date at the top, and I looked at the 9 flagged entries and the total figure, and I picked up my pen, and I wrote one word underneath the total Bridget I had not called her yet. I was going to call her in the morning. But tonight I was going to sit in the quiet of a flat that still knew exactly who I was. And I was going to read every document on that hard drive from the beginning to the end. And I was going to build in my notebook the complete and ordered and unambiguous record of everything I had found and everything that had subsequently been done to ensure that I could not report finding it. And when I was finished, the notebook would contain something that no administrative instruction and no permission level and no institutional authority of any kind could touch. Because it would be in my handwriting, in my flat, in a notebook that had never been inside that building. And the only way to erase it was to erase me. And I was still here. I closed the curtains on Thursday evening, and I did not open them again until Saturday morning. And in the 48 hours between those two moments, I did not sleep more than 3 hours in total. And I did not leave the flat, and I ate what was in the kitchen without paying much attention to what it was. And I drank more tea than I would normally consider reasonable, and I sat at the desk with the hard drive connected to the laptop and my notebook open beside it. And I worked in the way that I work when the thing in front of me has stopped being a task and has become a question that I cannot leave unanswered, which is without interruption and without the part of my mind that monitors comfort and fatigue, having very much say in the proceedings. The first thing I did was build the map. A forensic accountant does not begin with conclusions and does not begin with suspicions, and begins instead with the data in its raw form laid out in the order in which it exists before any interpretation has been applied to it. And the reason for this is that interpretation applied too early narrows the field of vision. And a narrow field of vision is how significant things get missed. And I had not missed anything yet. And I was not going to start. Now I took the 9 flagged entries from the cross ledger analysis and I laid them out chronologically in the notebook. And for each one, I recorded the client fund reference and the transfer amount and the intermediary account number and the shell entity registration number and the percentage extracted before the remainder was forwarded to the correct destination. And when they were all laid out across 4 pages of the notebook, the thing that I had sensed in the office on Tuesday evening, but had not yet fully articulated, became visible in a way that the individual entries had not made visible on their own, which was that the 9 instances were not 9 separate decisions, but one continuous operation. And the rotation of shell entities and the variation in intermediary accounts was not randomness, but maintenance. And the operation had been maintained for 4 years, with a consistency and a discipline that required not one person with system access, but several people with complementary access levels. Because no single user permission in a firm structured like Callaway Meridian would allow one person to initiate a transfer and route it, and create the receiving entity, and reconcile the ledger entry afterward. And the distribution of those tasks across multiple access levels meant the distribution of those tasks across multiple people. I wrote the word structure in the notebook and I drew a box around it. Then I went back to the shell entity registration numbers. There were 11 distinct entities across the 9 instances, because 2 of the instances had used the same entity twice before it was retired and replaced. And I had the registration numbers from the compliance report documentation, and I began working through them using the public corporate registry databases that are accessible to anyone who knows how to read them, which forensic accountants do. And the first 4 entities resolved in the way I had expected, which was to holding companies registered in low disclosure jurisdictions with nominee directors, and no visible operational activity. And the 5th and 6th were the same, and the 7th was the same. And then I reached the 8th entity, which was a company called Meridian Coastal Development Holdings. And the name stopped me because the first word of it was the second word of the firm's own name. And I sat with that for a moment, and then I kept reading. Meridian Coastal Development Holdings was registered in Montenegro. It was not dormant. It had been incorporated 4 years and 2 months ago, which was 3 months before the first flagged transfer in my cross-ledger analysis. And it had filed annual returns each year showing active development operations. And its registered address was a legal services firm in Podgorica. But its operational address, listed in the supplementary filings, was a coastal estate development site in the Bay of Kotor, which I looked up because the name was specific enough to locate, and what I found was a development of 12 luxury waterfront properties in various stages of construction, with an estimated completion value listed in a Montenegrin property investment prospectus at 47 million euros. I sat back from the desk. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I looked back at the screen. The money that had been skimmed from 9 client fund transfers over 4 years had not been extracted and spent and dispersed into untraceable personal expenditure, which is the most common pattern in this category of fraud, and is also the most difficult to prosecute because dispersal destroys the chain. And without the chain, you have evidence of extraction, but not evidence of destination. And destination is what turns a financial irregularity into a criminal conspiracy with recoverable assets. The money had been invested. It had been pooled and directed and used to fund the construction of a physical asset that existed at a specific address in a specific country. And that asset was now worth 47 million euros, and it was sitting there, registered to a holding company. And the holding company had directors, and directors have names. And names are on documents, and documents are in registries, and registries are public. I opened the Montenegrin corporate registry. I found Meridian Coastal Development Holdings. I opened the director listing. There were 4 names. The first name was the CEO of Callaway, Meridian Asset Management, whose name I will not use here, but who I had seen present at client briefings and board meetings, and who had a profile on the firm's website describing his 22 years of experience in institutional asset management and his commitment to client value and fiduciary responsibility. The second name I did not recognize and resolved on further searching to a private individual with no public profile and a residential address in Geneva, which suggested a function that was administrative rather than operational. The third name was a non-executive board member of Callaway Meridian, whose role on the firm's website was described as chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. I read that title twice. The chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. The person whose institutional function was to provide independent oversight of exactly the kind of activity I had found in the cross-ledger. Analysis was a registered director of the entity that was receiving the proceeds of that activity and had been for 4 years and 2 months and had presumably been chairing Audit and Risk Committee meetings throughout that period with the specific and comprehensive knowledge of what those meetings were failing to find because he already knew where it was. The fourth name was another non-executive board member whose listed responsibility on the firm's website was regulatory compliance and stakeholder governance. I put my pen down. I looked at the 4 names in my notebook. And I understood with the complete and settled clarity of a person who has just finished reading a set of structural drawings and identified not a flaw in one beam, but a flaw in the underlying design, that what I was looking at was not a CEO who had found a method to extract client funds and had subsequently panicked when a forensic accountant filed a compliance report and had made the impulsive decision to delete her file in order to buy himself time. What I was looking at was a board-level decision. The erasure of my file had not been the reaction of one frightened man operating alone in the hours after my report landed in the compliance portal, and it had been a coordinated response executed with the speed and the reach that only becomes available when the people responsible for institutional oversight are the same people who require that oversight to fail. And the compliance report had not been deleted because it was inconvenient to one person. And it had been deleted because it was existential to several. And the several included the people whose titles and whose salaries and whose reputational authority existed specifically to prevent the thing they were doing and had been doing for 4 years and 2 months in a coastal development on the Bay of Kotor. I thought about Liam's voice on the phone. I thought about the please. I understood now what the instruction had looked like and where it had come from. And I understood that the people who had delivered it had not been acting out of institutional caution, but out of the specific and highly motivated self-interest of individuals, with 47 million reasons to ensure that the record showed nothing, and the person who had found the record did not exist. I picked up my pen. I wrote the 4 names in the notebook. I drew a box around them, and I felt something shift inside me that I want to try to describe accurately, because it was not fear, and it was not anger, and it was the specific cold and professional curiosity that arrives when a structure that has been presenting itself as solid reveals its actual load-bearing logic, and you understand for the first time not just what it is, but how it was built, and therefore exactly where and how it can be taken apart. They had built something they believed was invisible. I had spent 6 years learning how to read the things that people build when they believe no one is watching. I turned to a fresh page in the notebook. I wrote one word at the top: Bridget. And this time I did not wait until morning. I noticed the car on Friday morning. It was a black sedan parked on the opposite side of the street from my building in a residence permit zone, and there was nothing immediately remarkable about it, except that it had been there when I closed the curtains on Thursday evening, and it was still there when I opened them on Saturday morning. And the permit zone on that side of the street belonged to a terrace of Victorian conversions whose residents I had observed over 3 years of living opposite them, and none of those residents drove a black sedan with a hire company sticker on the lower left corner of the rear windscreen. And I noted it in the way that I note things, which is without immediate conclusion, but with the specific quality of attention that means the information has been filed somewhere it can be retrieved quickly if it becomes relevant. It became relevant on Sunday. The car was gone, Saturday night, and back. Sunday morning, with what I was now confident was a different driver, based on the visible silhouette through the tinted glass and the different angle of the headrest adjustment. And I stood at the edge of the window where I could see out without being easily visible from the street. And I looked at the car for a long time, and I thought about the sequence of events, which was that I had filed a compliance report, and my file had been deleted, and my credentials had been wiped, and a colleague who had always been direct with me had asked me with genuine fear in his voice never to call him again. And now there was a hire car in a permit zone opposite my flat, with a rotating occupant who was not a resident. I thought about the word erasure. I had been using it in my notebook to describe what had been done to my professional record, but I understood, standing at the edge of my window on a Sunday morning, that erasure has more than one meaning, and that the sequence I was inside had a logic, and the logic had a next step, and the next step was not legal and was not institutional, and was the kind of step that becomes available to people who have decided that the problem they are managing is not a compliance report, but the person who filed it. I was not frightened. I want to be precise about that, because I think it is important to be honest about what I felt. And what I felt was not fear, but a cold and clarifying alertness that narrowed my focus to the immediate question, which was what to do next. And the answer to that question was the same answer it had been since Thursday evening, which was documentation, and the additional element was that I needed to move faster than I had been moving, because the car outside told me that the timeline I was operating on was not my own. I opened the old laptop on Monday evening. I say old because it was a personal machine I had used during my postgraduate degree and had kept in the flat without connecting it to any of my current accounts or networks. And I had charged it on Saturday as a precaution, because a device with no connection history to my current identity is a device that cannot be easily monitored, and I had not used it for anything yet. And when I opened it on Monday evening, there was a message in the webmail account I had created during my postgraduate years and had not accessed since, and the message had no subject line and no greeting and contained 4 words: I kept the logs. That was all it said. I sat with those 4 words for a long time, and then I replied with one word, which was where. And I closed the laptop and I waited, and the reply came 3 hours later, and it contained a time and a location and nothing else. And the location was Waterloo Station at 12:45 the following afternoon. And I read it, and I closed the laptop, and I sat in the dark of the flat with the curtains still drawn. And I thought about who had sent it, and how they had found the address. And the answer to the second question was that anyone with access to the firm's legacy HR system, which predated the current platform, would have an onboarding record containing the personal email address I had provided when I joined 6 years ago, and which was the address associated with the old webmail account. And the answer to the first question was that I did not know yet. But I was going to find out at 12:45 on Tuesday. Waterloo at that hour is not a place where a conversation can be easily recorded from a distance, because the ambient noise level is continuous and the foot traffic is dense enough that two people standing near the departures board are not remarkable. And I arrived 8 minutes early and stood where I could see the main concourse, and at 12:47 a man I did not recognize approached from the direction of the southern entrance, and he was young and unremarkable in appearance. And he stopped beside me and looked at the departures board and did not look at me, and said in a voice that was just above the noise threshold that his name did not matter, and that he had worked in the firm's legacy systems team until 4 months ago, when he had been asked to leave under a compromise agreement that included a non-disclosure clause which he had signed, but which he had been advised by his own solicitor did not extend to criminal evidence. And he said that before he left, he had made a copy of something, and he did not want money and did not want to be named, and wanted only for what was on the copy to be placed in front of the correct authority by someone who had the standing to present it. He held out his hand. There was a USB drive in it. I took it. He walked toward the northern exit and did not look back. I went home and I connected the USB to the old laptop on a non-networked connection, and I opened the single folder it contained, which was labeled DL. And inside the folder was a deletion log from the firm's personnel management system, and the log was a system-generated record of every manual deletion event performed on the platform in the previous 12 months. And I scrolled to the date of my compliance submission, and I found my employee record, and I found the deletion timestamp. And the deletion timestamp was 11:45 in the evening on the Wednesday. I had filed the report, which was 3 hours after the automated acknowledgement had been sent to my work email confirming receipt. The deletion had not been processed through the standard administrative workflow. It had not been flagged for review. It had been executed directly using a named credential login, and the named credential belonged to the CEO, and the CEO had logged into the personnel management system at 11:43 on a Wednesday night and had manually deleted my file and had logged out at 11:46. And the entire process had taken 3 minutes, and the 3 minutes told me everything about the level of panic and the level of guilt and the level of personal exposure that my compliance report had created in the person who was supposed to be the most senior fiduciary in the building. I had spent 4 days thinking about how to prove the fraud. I now had something that in certain respects was more immediately powerful than the fraud itself. I had the cover-up. And the cover-up had a timestamp. And the timestamp had a name. And the name was on a log that had been generated automatically by a system that does not care who is asking it to record what happened and simply records it. Because that is what systems built for accountability do when the people who should be accountable forget that the system is still running. I opened my notebook, I wrote 11:45, I drew a box around it, and I called Bridget. I had met Eleanor Voss 17 years ago when she was a senior compliance examiner at a mid-tier audit firm, and I was a postgraduate student who had been placed with her team for a 12-week practicum. And she had taught me 2 things in those 12 weeks that I had carried into every professional situation I had encountered since. And the first thing was that the most dangerous person in any financial investigation is not the one who knows the most, but the one who is willing to read the most carefully. And the second thing was that institutions do not commit fraud the way individuals commit fraud, which is impulsively and emotionally. but the way institutions do everything, which is through process and procedure and the exploitation of the gap between what a system is supposed to monitor and what it actually monitors. And if you want to understand institutional fraud, you do not start with the people, and you start with the gap. Eleanor was now a deputy director at the Financial Conduct Authority. I called her on her personal number on Tuesday evening after I returned from Waterloo Station, and she answered on the third ring. And I said her name, and she said mine. And I said I needed to meet her outside of any official channel, and I needed it to be soon. And there was a pause, and she said tomorrow morning, and she gave me an address in Bermondsey that I did not recognize. And she said to come alone and to leave my phone at home, and I said I would. And I did. I arrived at the Bermondsey address at 9 the following morning, which was a flat above a dry cleaning business on a quiet residential street. And Eleanor opened the door, and she looked at me for a moment in the way that people look at someone they have not seen in 2 years, and said, "Come in." And I came in, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I placed the notebook and the USB drive and the hard drive on the table, and I told her everything in the order that it had happened, starting with Tuesday evening in the office and ending with the man at Waterloo Station. And I spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, and Eleanor listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she looked at the 3 objects on the table, and she looked at me, and she said, "Walk me through the logic of the erasure." I said that the erasure had a structural flaw that the people who executed it had not considered, which was that my erasure was not a clean deletion, but a contradiction. And the contradiction was this, which was that I had been employed by Callaway Meridian Asset Management for 6 years. And during those 6 years, I had interacted with regulators and counterparties and clients and external auditors on the firm's behalf. And those interactions existed in records that the firm did not control and could not delete. And so the firm was now in one of 2 positions, neither of which was survivable without significant exposure. And the first position was that I existed, in which case the CEO had deleted my file in response to a valid compliance report and had committed whistleblower suppression and personnel fraud and was a criminal. And the second position was that I did not exist, in which case the firm had, for 6 years, been allowing an unregistered individual with no verifiable employment status to conduct regulated financial activity on behalf of its clients. And that was not a personnel matter and was a catastrophic regulatory breach of the kind that the FCA existed specifically to pursue. And I said that whichever position they chose to defend, they were choosing to be destroyed by it. And the only question was which destruction they preferred. Eleanor looked at me for a long time. Then she said 2 weeks. She said she needed 2 weeks and a complete master file connecting every element from the cross-ledger analysis through the shell entities to the Montenegro development to the deletion log, and she said she could provide a working space that was not connected to anything they were monitoring, and I said I would need my hard drive and my notebook and access to the corporate registry databases. And she said all of that was available. And she said one more thing, which was that I should not contact the firm and should not respond to any communication from the firm and should not acknowledge that any negotiation was possible. And I said that was not going to be a problem. I spent the next 14 days in a service flat in Vauxhall that had no registered connection to Eleanor or to the FCA, and had a clean laptop and the corporate registry access I needed. And I worked from 7 in the morning until midnight every day, and I built the master ledger, which was a complete documented chain connecting the 11 shell entities to Meridian Coastal Development Holdings, to the 4 named directors, to the specific client fund transfers. And I cross-referenced every node in the chain with a corresponding entry in either the deletion log or the compliance submission or the access records that Marcus had provided, and by the end of the 14 days, the master ledger was 112 pages, and every page was sourced, and every source was either a public registry document or a system-generated record or a forensic analysis, and there was not a single page that contained interpretation without documentation underneath it. On the 9th day, I received a call on the old laptop through the webmail account from a number I did not recognize, and the message was not threatening and was not hostile, and was written in the careful language of a legal team that was feeling the ground shifting under it, and it offered a settlement figure and a mutual non-disclosure agreement and a restoration of my employment record in exchange for the return of all copied documentation and my permanent silence. I read it once. I did not reply. On the 11th day, a second message arrived with a higher figure. I did not reply to that one either. I understood something in those 14 days that I had not fully understood before I was erased, which was that the most powerful position in any conflict involving institutional resources is not the position with the most money, and is not the position with the most legal firepower, and is the position with the most accurate information about what is actually true. And the firm had spent the previous 2 weeks believing that I was frightened and isolated and financially vulnerable, and that belief had made them careless, and the carelessness had made them communicative. And the communications were now saved in a folder on the clean laptop under a file name I had called offers, and the offers were not settlement documents, and were in the context of everything else in the master ledger. Admissions and admissions from a regulated financial entity attempting to suppress a whistleblower report are not a civil matter. On the 14th day, I printed the master ledger. I placed it in a document case. I called Eleanor. I said it was ready. She said, "Come in tomorrow morning." I closed the notebook. I looked at the hard drive. I looked at the USB drive. I looked at the printed master ledger in its case. And I thought about a CEO logging into a personnel system at 11:43 on a Wednesday night, believing that 3 minutes and one deletion would be enough to make a forensic accountant disappear. And I thought about the specific quality of confidence that leads a person to believe that. And I thought about what that confidence is built on, which is the assumption that the person being erased will experience the erasure the way it was intended, which is as an ending. I picked up the document case. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of the record. The Callaway Meridian 25th Anniversary Gala was held on a Thursday evening in November at a hotel in Mayfair that had been built to make powerful people feel permanent. And the ballroom was full of exactly the kind of people who had spent their careers cultivating that feeling. Which is to say that the room contained 200 individuals who had built their professional identities on the assumption that the institutions they served were solid, and that the people at the top of those institutions had earned the position they occupied, and the evening had been designed to confirm that assumption with warm lighting and good wine, and a program that culminated in a speech from the man who had deleted my file at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. While I was at home not knowing yet that I had been made to disappear, I arrived with Eleanor and 2 FCA colleagues, and there were 2 officers from the Metropolitan Police Economic Crime Unit already positioned inside, and I was wearing the same dark coat I wear to every professional meeting, and I was carrying the document case, and I was not nervous, because nervousness belongs to the phase of a process where the outcome is uncertain. And the outcome was no longer uncertain, and had not been uncertain since the day I placed the master ledger on Eleanor's desk, and watched her read the first 12 pages without looking up. The CEO was at the podium when we entered. He was midway through a sentence about the firm's founding principles, and the sentence contained the word integrity, and I heard the word from the back of the room, and I noted it. and I walked to the technology booth where the young technician from the event production company was waiting. And he had been briefed, and he stepped aside without being asked. And I connected the clean laptop to the display system, and I looked at the screen in front of me for a moment. And then I looked at the back of the room where Eleanor was standing, and she looked at me and gave me a single nod, which meant that the FCA colleagues and the police officers were in position, and that the room was contained, and that what happened next was mine to begin. The CEO said that 25 years of consistent performance was not an accident. I pressed the key. Every screen in the ballroom changed at once. The warm promotional images of the firm's history disappeared, and what replaced them on every wall of the room was the two-panel display I had formatted in the Vauxhall flat during the 14 days I had spent building the master ledger, and the left panel was the deletion log with the timestamp of 11:43, and the CEO's named credential in plain text. And the right panel was the fraud map with the Montenegro development and the 4 director names in a column that was readable from anywhere in the room, because I had built it to be read from exactly this distance. The CEO stopped speaking. The room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when 200 people receive the same information simultaneously, and the information requires all of them to recalibrate everything they thought they were doing that evening. And the silence lasted long enough to have a texture, and the texture was the specific quality of a collective understanding, arriving all at once in a space that had been designed for a completely different kind of evening. He looked at the screens. He looked at the 4 names. He looked at the timestamp. And then he looked at the back of the room, and he found my face. And I looked back at him, and I want to tell you what that moment was, because I think it matters. And what it was is this, which is that for the first time in the entire duration of what he had built and what he had done, and what he had decided on a Wednesday night in 11 minutes, I was the most visible person in the room, and he was the one who had ceased to exist in any version of events that was going to be written from this point forward. The FCA colleagues moved toward the podium. The police officers moved toward the board members. I closed the laptop and I picked up the document case and I walked out. 6 months later, I am sitting at a desk in a building I have chosen for myself, and on the desk in front of me is the personnel file of a new employee. And I am reading it the way I read everything, which is carefully and completely, because a file is not a person, but it is the beginning of a record, and a record matters. And the people whose names are in it matter. And the work of keeping that record honest is not glamorous, and is not dramatic, and is simply the most important work. The CEO is awaiting trial. The board members are awaiting trial. Constance Vale has been struck off. The firm paid a fine that will appear in regulatory history for decades, and I am here. A person is not a file, and a person is not a line of code, sitting in a database waiting to be overwritten. And the people who build their safety on the erasure of others make the same mistake every time, which is that they delete the record and believe they have deleted the truth. And the truth does not live in the record, and the truth lives in the person who found it and wrote it down and kept it in a kitchen drawer and waited. They erased my file, they forgot about me. That was their only mistake, and it was the only one they needed to make. If this story found you somewhere real, then leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. Because I read every single one. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do it now. Because there are more stories coming, and every one of them is about someone who refused to disappear. And if this gave you something today, a like takes 2 seconds and helps this reach the person who needs to hear it next. And I will see you in the next story.